Hey guys, welcome to week 7 of the ReVision experience. I'm Sean.
I'm Miley.
And last week we talked about what does that first gateway look like from Act 1 to Act 2, and how do we make sure that our story has moved into the middle. And that's a really important part of telling the story. I think it's something that can engage the reader to a point where they're not going to stop reading now. Mm-hmm. Like they've taken an interest in your protagonist. They realize what the stakes are, and they're sort of bought in at that point. Like, okay, right. I'm ready to see what happens.
Right.
So your reader's coming along with you. The challenge, I think, comes in writing what we've always called the messy middle.
The messy middle is hard because it comes in our 9-month novel class. It comes several months into the writing process, and at this point, you're getting tired. Right? Mm-hmm. You're getting tired. The story is becoming sometimes a little unwieldy. You're like, wait, what am I doing? Like, where is this going? What's my point?
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of times in that first draft, we find this section can have a lot of gunk. Like just stuff that you're like, oh gosh, what was I doing? What was I thinking? And so we're having to sort through that mess that we created, which we wanted to create in our first draft. We needed to. That was part of it.
Yeah.
But now we have to clean it up.
That's what I wanted to say, is that the strategy for the messy middle in the first draft is like, let's make stuff happen.
Yeah.
Let's introduce new characters. Let's start a new subplot. All of these things to try and really grasp at what is happening in the story and how can we make it interesting.
Right.
But all of that grasping and adding, that's not what we're doing now in the ReVision. In the ReVision, we're trying to organize. We're trying to make things concise. We're trying to introduce causality. And so that often is sort of at odds with the approach that we were taking in our first draft. And that's what we want to encourage you today, is to look at each of the scenes. You've identified, hopefully, the gateway from Act 1 to Act 2. Now we want to start to look at those scenes in the middle and ask a few questions. We want to ask ourselves, how are they contributing? And James Scott Bell has some really helpful, in his book, Plot and Structure, has some really helpful ways of thinking, or some questions to ask, sort of a filter to run each of these scenes through. And so those are the things that we want to talk about today. The first question that you want to ask is, does this scene, or what I'm writing about in the messy middle, does it deepen relationships between characters?
That's what the beauty of the middle is that you really, really get to dive into your characters' relationships with one another. And that's where you create so many connections with your reader. This is when your reader really starts to connect with your characters and you deepen that connection.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really beautiful, necessary things that are happening in the middle. It's just making sure that it's working.
Yeah, and you think about the things that happen in the middle of your favorite books. Those are the things that really draw you to the story and draw you to the characters. Because I'm thinking, again, we talked last week about the Hunger Games. Like when Katniss is training for the Hunger Games, and sort of right up to when the Hunger Games begin, that's when you fall in love with the people around her, right? Like that's when you fall in love with the people who she's going to be competing with. Or you really start to despise the people she's going to be, because we're deepening these relationships. And deepening relationships doesn't mean that everyone's falling in love with each other and it's all kumbaya. Like it could also mean this is the place where you're deepening the conflict, where you're deepening the hatred or the dislike between characters. And so that's what makes the messy middle such a beautiful part of the story, is this deepening of relationships between characters.
Well, and I think that what you were saying taps into James Scott Bell's second point, which is keep us caring, keep us reading.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to make sure we're doing in the middle. We need to make sure there are scenes, the plot is unfolding in a way that propels our readers forward. They want to keep reading. They want to go chapter to chapter to chapter and not put it down. But we do that by keeping them caring.
Yeah.
We keep them caring with the things that we're revealing within the messy middle.
Yeah.
Yes, I feel like we're giving it a bad rap.
We are giving it a bad rap. Along with what Miley's saying, I think this is where we can identify some of the new things that we introduced maybe in our first draft. And I know we've been encouraging you to cut things, but maybe it's time to reevaluate some of these things and see about, okay, maybe I don't have to cut this. Maybe I can introduce it in a different way so that it works. So maybe you have some new characters coming in the middle. And maybe at first you thought, I don't know, these feel a little bit extra. Maybe I need to cut them. Well, now think about how their presence can deepen the relationships among the characters. And maybe that's a reason to keep them. Or maybe you have a particular a thing that happens that you introduced, a subplot. How can that deepen the characters' relationships? Maybe it's not time to cut. Maybe it's time to use these things to add depth to the story, and that can make your middle a better section. And then finally, what this middle section really needs to do is set up the final battle. So as you're thinking through what's happening, what are you introducing, what are you telling us about your characters, you've written this first draft, right? So you know the ending now. You didn't know the ending when you wrote the messy middle in your first draft, but you know the ending now. So how can you begin to set us up?
Right.
How can you begin to prepare us or surprise us? How can you introduce things that will surprise us at the end? This is where you start to think about that in the middle of the book.
And that's just one of the best parts of a revision, is that you know how it all ends. You know how this whole thing was supposed to go. And so now you get to make it look like you knew what you were doing, right?
Right.
Like you look like you knew what you were doing all along by the time you finished this revision, when you didn't, when you did the first draft. But this is your
Neil
chance.
Gaiman quote, by the way.
Neil Gaiman. So this is the time that you get to do that. And this is really, I love this part, because I feel like this is when you start to put the connections together, and it feels like, oh my gosh, this was like meant to be. And you feel like something bigger is happening in your story. Like, I don't know. I love that.
Yeah.
I love getting to set up towards the end. And just, I think it's a really special time in the story for a writer to see how this is all coming together to the crescendo.
Yeah. Every good story is kind of a mystery story, right? Like there's something that you're wanting to find out. There's something that you're waiting to see. You want to know what happens in the end. So really use this middle to set that up as best as you can.
All right. You guys, keep going. You're doing awesome. I know that this can be really, really tedious work sometimes, but I hope that you can also find the delight in it, like the excitement in it, because you're getting there and you're getting it done. And we want to encourage you to just keep at it. Keep at it.
Yep. Keep revising.